This trash isn't worth $1.
Everybody laugh at her, and just standing there, no help, no single word. That sket is all the nighttime of her, and all the love. But just like that, all gone. And now look, this women, all she have, all she got. Will bury, soon let go to the story. This piece of garbage isn't even worth a single dollar. Those 10 words dropped onto the terrazzo floor of the advanced studio classroom, dry and cold like a hammer striking the chest of a 19-year-old girl. Maya Lin stood isolated in the center of the podium. Around her, lazy, careless chuckles began to ripple. The effortless mockery of those who had never paid a price for anything in their lives, yet felt entitled to strip away everything from another. That laughter would echo in Maya's mind through many long, tempestuous years to come. To produce that charcoal sketch, Maya had endured 3 sleepless nights. She had huddled over a battered wooden table, its surface stained with overlapping ink blotches, inside a cramped rented room of less than 150 square feet in the Bronx, New York. Her greatest asset at the time was a cheap box of charcoal sticks purchased from a second-hand bookstore. Pieces worn down so low she had to wrap them in paper extensions just to maintain a grip. Under a single desk lamp casting a stagnant amber hue, Maya had stared deep into the face of her mother, a black woman who had raised her on exhausting night shifts, striving to capture a dignity that words could never fully articulate. The drawing hit the floor with a dull thud before Maya could even blink. And then, a sound cut through the air. The horrific noise that no art student could ever forget. The crisp, ruthless tearing of heavyweight multimedia paper in two. An oppressive silence fell over the room. That silence was more terrifying than the mockery that preceded it, for it meant everyone had witnessed it. Everyone understood exactly what had transpired, yet not a single soul moved. The 2 halves of the torn paper hovered momentarily before settling onto the cement floor like shot birds, tattered and wounded. Maya did not cry. She stood frozen, bearing the posture of someone whose deepest, most unspoken fear had just been validated by the world, even as her heart desperately wished it were only a nightmare. At that moment, no one in that room, suffused with the scent of turpentine and institutional hypocrisy, knew. Not the snickering students, not the powerful woman holding the shears, and not even Maya herself. They were all oblivious to the silver-haired man standing quietly out in the drafty corridor. A veteran art conservator who had recently retired, he had paused by the classroom door, catching a glimpse of the charcoal portrait just a second before its destruction. He felt a sudden jolt course down his spine, an emotion reawakening after 20 years of assumed dormancy. The Manhattan Academy of Fine Arts occupied 4 floors of a historic red brick building in the heart of the Upper East Side. It was a prestigious address that routinely graced the biographies of renowned artists whose names were etched into the stone walls of major museums. The floors here were polished granite. The floor-to-ceiling windows welcomed the city's radiant sunlight, and the waiting list for the Advanced Talent Workshop stretched 18 months long. The tuition, amounting to tens of thousands of dollars per semester, acted as a natural filter, silently ensuring that the students walking these sunlit corridors belonged to an affluent, privileged world, and almost entirely a white one. Maya Lin did not belong to that world. She grew up in a narrow alley adjacent to a subway line where dozens of trains rattled the moldy walls daily, and the sole window looked out onto a temporary trash collection site. Maya pursued drawing because drawing was the only thing that cost nothing. A pencil and a blank sheet of paper never demanded resources she couldn't provide. She entered the academy on a single full-ride scholarship, a merit prize awarded only once every 3 years when an applicant's talent was too radiant for the admissions board to find a reason to deny. Maya accepted the scholarship quietly, declining the modest celebration her mother painstakingly tried to prepare. Even at 17, Maya understood that setting foot in this room was merely the threshold of an entirely different crucible. Every morning, she caught an early subway from the Bronx, transferring twice, arriving at the academy with charcoal dust embedded beneath her fingernails. On crowded train cars, she constantly sketched the faces of strangers, people who would never know they had just been immortalized on the backs of crumpled supermarket receipts or subway tickets. She wore the same 3 old shirts in rotation and ate packed lunches from home because the lobby cafe sold a single pastry for the equivalent of her mother's daily earnings. She had never learned how to look at people spending money carelessly and feel at ease. Maya was the only low-income black student in the advanced portrait class. She had a way of rendering herself as small as possible, sitting in the shadowed corner near the door, speaking only when addressed by name. Yet, the pieces she produced occasionally forced other students to glance over with guarded apprehension before turning away, because the raw honesty and sheer depth of her work made them profoundly uneasy in a way they couldn't articulate. Professor Victoria Vance had taught at the Manhattan Academy for 19 years. That was long enough for her personal preferences to calcify into institutional mandates, and for her deep-seated biases to be mistaken for elite aesthetic judgment. At 53, Vance possessed a sharp face with a prominent, angular jawline, always radiating the confidence of someone who had never faced serious opposition within academia. She favored expensive cashmere dresses and kept her chin tilted slightly upward as she glided through the studio, as though the air near the ceiling were purer than the air the rest of mankind breathed. She had published 2 textbooks on color theory and hosted an online seminar on the democratization of modern art that garnered hundreds of thousands of views. Her lectures were eloquent, her books highly systematic, but her pedagogy was the absolute antithesis of her public declarations. Inside the studio, Vance moved like a prevailing wind, warming the students she favored and freezing out those she had prematurely deemed unworthy of her energy. She had formed her judgment of Maya Lin within the first 4 minutes of the opening semester, shortly after Maya took her seat. That decision was never given a concrete, spoken reason. Systemic, deeply entrenched racial biases rarely require public justification. Instead, it manifested under the guise of academic standards and professional intuition, meticulously camouflaged in specialized jargon until the professor herself was convinced it had nothing to do with the student's skin color. Vance looked at Maya's easel. The cheap drawing pad, the stubby, worn pencils, the economical, cautious way the girl organized her workspace. Something on Vance's face shut tight like an iron door. From that moment on, Maya became invisible, or worse than invisible. She was an inconvenience, an Afro-American scholarship student who had slipped into a sanctuary where she did not belong. Vance's absolute favorite was a white student named Charlotte, the daughter of a prominent art collector who owned 2 major galleries in Soho. Charlotte was genuinely talented, possessing a loose, confident stroke and an intuitive instinct for color that many artists twice her age still struggled to achieve. But talent was not the sole reason Charlotte became the golden child, and everyone in the room understood this on a cellular level, even if it went unsaid. Vance selected Charlotte's paintings for the Academy's autumn exhibition, kept her after hours for private 30-minute technical mentorship sessions, and heralded her name in an art magazine interview as a compelling new voice to watch. When other students produced exceptional work, Vance's praise was measured and transactional. But when Charlotte completed a drawing, the professor's eyes sparked with genuine investment. The classroom had its hierarchies, mirroring any microsociety. Charlotte stood at the apex, Just below her were students with gallery connections and parental art collections. And at the absolute nadir of this informal ranking was Maya Lin, the one who held no leverage, the one whom Vance covertly dismissed as painting subjects that are too coarse, leaning heavily into aggressive identity politics, and lacking the baseline elegance of classical Western art. The worst part was not the favoritism itself, but how the other students absorbed Vance's coded contempt and replicated it in their own behavior. They looked away when Maya spoke during critiques, avoided pairing with her for group assignments, and snickered whenever Vance dropped razor-sharp remarks about the sentimentality of the ghetto, or raw emotions devoid of aesthetic refinement. Critiques that never named anyone directly but always pierced in one specific direction. Maya noticed it all. She recognized it and remained silent. She kept drawing, because besides that, what else could she do? Sarah, Maya's mother, worked 2 jobs simultaneously. She cleaned corporate offices 5 nights a week for a commercial janitorial service in Midtown, earning meager wages with no benefits. On Saturday and Sunday mornings, she worked at a public laundromat in the Bronx, an environment perpetually thick with the scent of fabric softener and the oppressive heat radiating from industrial dryers. She had lived this way for 11 years, ever since her husband was killed by gun violence in their old neighborhood. At 44, she carried the appearance of a woman well past 60. Fatigue was deeply etched into her dark skin, carved around the corners of her eyes and mouth, visible in the heavy slump of her shoulders whenever she stood. The posture of someone who had carried an unyielding weight for far too long. She never complained. Not because she lacked grievances against her fate, but because she had decided early on that complaining was a luxury, much like sleep, that she simply could not afford. She returned home at 6 in the morning, prepared a lunchbox for Maya before waking her up, slept at 7:30, and woke again at 3 in the afternoon. In the brief hours between waking and prepping for her night shift, she cooked dinner, calculated bills, and asked about Maya's classes with an attentiveness that never waned. The one thing Sarah refused to tolerate was allowing her daughter to feel like a burden. Maya had drawn her mother hundreds of times. Quick sketches on napkins, careful studies in notebooks, or abstract compositions where her mother appeared merely as a seated silhouette or a sliver of shadow. Yet she had never produced anything that felt worthy of the reality of that woman. In October, with the semester half over and the looming pressure of the upcoming scholarship review hanging over her like a block of lead, Maya decided to try again. She arranged her materials on their small dining table. Late one night after her mother left for work, she had 2 sheets of high-quality drawing paper, premium cotton paper she had scraped together money for over months. She placed a photograph of her mother on the table, taken the previous Thanksgiving. Her mother was smiling, but the smile didn't reach her eyes, and she wore a knit cardigan with frayed hems. Maya looked at the photograph for a long time, then set the first charcoal strokes upon the white surface. She worked continuously for 3 nights. Maya slept only in brief 2-hour increments on the sofa, waking to draw for another 4 hours, attending classes in a fog of exhaustion before returning home to pick up the charcoal once more. She was attempting something she had never dared before, not just replicating her mother's physical features, but rendering her core identity and heritage. The essence of a love expressed through sacrifice, a tenderness surviving within utter exhaustion, the unyielding dignity of a black woman rising above societal marginalization. She drew each wrinkle on her mother's face as if it were a sentence in a language she was only beginning to decipher. The dark circles beneath the eyes, the slight asymmetry of the lips, and the hands. She dedicated an entire night solely to the hands. Those rough, calloused hands that had packed thousands of lunches and scrubbed miles of flooring, yet always cradled Maya's face with absolute gentleness whenever she fell ill. When it was finished, Maya stepped back and looked at her work. She felt something that wasn't quite pride, but was adjacent to it. A profound sense of having spoken the truth, perhaps for the first time in her artistic life. It was the best thing she had ever created. She knew it not through logic, but through her body, via the quiet certainty that arrives when a piece falls precisely into its rightful place. She brought it to class on Tuesday morning, carefully rolled inside a protective plastic tube. For the first time in 4 months at the Manhattan Academy, she permitted herself to hope. Vance conducted the critique as she always did, pausing before each easel with a calculating expression, delivering assessments with the deliberate curation of someone who knew exactly which words would slice deepest into the listener's heart. She commended Charlotte's new oil study, calling it academic and sophisticated. She spent 8 minutes before the easel of a white male student named Julian, whom she judged as technically proficient though conventional, utilizing a soft tone to cushion her criticisms. She spent roughly 45 seconds on the student sitting next to Maya, and then she turned. Her gaze fell upon Maya's charcoal portrait. Something flickered across Vance's face that Maya had never seen there before. Not immediate dismissiveness, but a brief, startled arrest, immediately overtaken by an expression resembling deep-seated anger and revulsion. Vance unpinned the portrait from the easel. She held it at arm's length. The entire studio fell into a breathless, suffocating silence. "Who is this supposed to be?" she asked. Her voice carried a completely different pitch than her usual critique tone. It was flatter, colder, laced with a razor-sharp edge of prejudice that every student felt but could not openly name. Maya stated quietly that it was her mother. Vance tilted the drawing slightly, as if examining it from a hostile angle. "The composition is overly sentimental," she remarked. "The emotion is cheap, thoroughly burdened by the aggressive identity politics of minority artists. This looks like graffiti one would find on a subway car, meant for people who have never seen real art." She paused, locking eyes with Maya. "This is the type of work we expect from an amateur hobbyist in the slums, not from a scholarship student in an advanced studio at this academy." Laughter erupted, starting from the back rows, where cruel impulses and complicit biases always found their footing. Maya looked at the portrait in Vance's hands. Her mother's face, her mother's hands, the creation forged through 3 sleepless nights out of pure love. Something surged within Maya's chest, overriding her fear. She looked directly at the powerful woman and said, "You don't understand what you are looking at." The studio dropped into an entirely new dimension of silence. Vance stared at Maya. The professor's expression wasn't one of rage, not yet. It was far colder and more calculating. The look of a ruler handed the perfect pretext to punish an inferior who dared challenge her absolute authority. She placed the portrait back onto the easel, walked to her desk, and returned holding a large pair of heavy studio shears. She gripped the drawing. She cut straight through it from top to bottom, dividing the portrait in a slow, deliberate motion. The heavy cotton paper gave a sharp, dry groan as it parted. She released her grip, letting the 2 severed halves flutter down onto the floor. "That is my evaluation of this street art," Vance stated smoothly. Stepping toward the next easel without a backward glance, the class moved with her. No one looked at Maya. No one said a word. The 2 halves of Sarah's portrait lay face up on the terrazzo floor, the charcoal-drawn hands nearly touching at the frayed edge of the tier. Consumed by a profound numbness, Maya packed her belongings, gathered the 2 severed pieces of paper tightly against her chest, and retreated down to the building's basement, where an entirely different world awaited her. The Academy's basement was nominally a supply depository, though over decades it had accumulated into a complex labyrinth of wrapped canvases, dust-laden plaster molds, and defunct equipment from 100 semesters past. In the deepest, most remote corner, past a row of rusting iron cabinets, sat a small workspace. There, due to an old property dispute from years ago that was never fully resolved, An elderly man named Arthur Pendleton had been permitted by the administration to occupy a corner equipped with a large wooden workbench, fluorescent lighting, and access to the Academy's chemical restoration inventory in exchange for occasional expert consultations. Arthur was 71 years old and had dedicated 40 years of his life as a senior conservator and restoration specialist at the Metropolitan Museum of Art before retiring. He was a slender man of slow but incredibly precise movements, perpetually carrying the chemical aroma of solvents and varnishes. He had sought out this basement because he needed a purpose, and because he found that young minority artists who had not yet been corrupted by institutional fame were far more compelling than most of the elite white artists he had spent his career serving. Arthur was sorting through a collection of century-old prints when the basement door creaked open. Maya Lin entered. Her face was entirely expressionless, a terrifying composure that demanded a far higher internal cost than breaking down in tears. She sat at an empty workbench, laying the two pieces of paper flat. She didn't weep, she didn't speak. She simply stared at the fractured face of her mother, with an expression Arthur recognized instantly from across the room. He had seen that look many times in his life. The gaze of someone who had just witnessed something irreplaceable destroyed by brutal prejudice. He approached quietly. He studied the work for a long time without uttering a word. Then, pulling up a stool, he sat opposite Maya and spoke in a voice devoid of pity or performative sympathy, carrying only absolute seriousness. "This drawing is extraordinary." He introduced himself and she shared her name. He asked if he could restore it. Maya looked at him, this elderly white man in a basement surrounded by ancient clutter, offering something she hadn't requested. And then she nodded. What Arthur did not tell her immediately, because the timing was not yet right, was that he had known someone in her family a very long time ago. He had once known a woman named Elizabeth Lynn, a highly gifted black painter who worked in charcoal and watercolor during the early 1970s. The height of the black arts movement, when both he and Elizabeth were young and the New York art scene was a fierce ideological battleground. Elizabeth was Maya's grandmother, who had passed away before Maya was born. Her work had been largely unacknowledged by major museums due to the institutional racial barriers of that era. Her canvases left to gather dust in an old warehouse in Harlem. Arthur had thought of Elizabeth occasionally over the decades, the way one remembers a monumental talent eclipsed by historical injustice, a sorrow without a name. Now, sitting across from her granddaughter, looking at the torn portrait, he felt the weight of several decades pressing upon his chest like a generational debt finally coming due. Arthur worked on the drawing for 6 consecutive days. He utilized Japanese tissue paper and wheat starch paste to reinforce the reverse side, meticulously aligning the fibers of the tear with such precision that from a distance of 2 feet, the fracture vanished entirely. But the physical restoration was only a fraction of his work. Using fine cotton swabs and a half-century of expertise, he carefully accentuated what Maya's charcoal strokes had achieved, elements she herself perhaps didn't fully comprehend yet. It was the way the light on the dark skin within the portrait seemed to emanate from within the subject rather than shining upon it from the outside. It was the way the hands retained a dynamic presence even in still life, as if caught mid-gesture in an act of protection. He cleansed the smudges Maya couldn't avoid during her 3 exhausting nights of labor. When finished, he stepped back, admired the work, and picked up his phone to call a woman named Eleanor Vance Bourne. Eleanor, 62, was a highly influential African-American senior curator and the founder of an independent art consultancy in Brooklyn dedicated to discovering and elevating the careers of young artists of color and indigenous backgrounds from working-class communities. She had collaborated with Arthur for 30 years and trusted his professional eye implicitly. She arrived at the basement on a Thursday afternoon, standing before the restored portrait for 4 minutes without saying a word. For someone like Eleanor, this was an anomaly. She had built her reputation on rapid, decisive evaluations, the ability to walk through a gallery and know within seconds what possessed value and what did not. 4 minutes of silence was a form of supreme reverence she rarely dispensed. Finally, she turned to Arthur. "Who drew this?" Arthur told her the story. She requested to meet Maya. The meeting occurred 2 days later in the basement workshop, the restored portrait mounted on the workbench between the three of them. Eleanor questioned Maya about her mother, her creative process, and her education. She asked, with the directness of someone who wasn't performing, but genuinely wanted to comprehend. At the conclusion of their conversation, she extended an offer. She wished to submit the portrait to an upcoming international exhibition titled The Profiles of Dignity, set to open at the Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts the following spring before embarking on a 2-year tour across 4 major cities. Maya agreed. The Profiles of Dignity exhibition opened on a late March afternoon and instantly captured the attention of the American media. The exhibition showcased 42 works by 38 artists from diverse backgrounds, but it was Maya's charcoal portrait, listed simply in the catalog as My Mother, charcoal on cotton paper, 60 by 80 centimeters, that compelled critics to linger the longest. A veteran cultural correspondent for the New York Times wrote that the artwork arrested him in the center of the auditorium in a way very few drawings had over his 20-year career. The piece possessed something incredibly specific: the face of a particular black woman, marked by her exhaustion and her love, yet it simultaneously held a universal truth about human dignity. It proved that authentic art touches the human heart not through abstraction, but through an unyielding realism that defies racial stratification. Another prominent art critic used the word earth-shaking twice in a brief paragraph to describe the structural rendering of light on the skin and hands within the drawing. The narrative surrounding the artwork ignited across cultural columns nationwide. People grew fascinated by the 19-year-old girl behind it, the stubby charcoal sticks, and the mother who spent her nights cleaning offices in Midtown while living in the Bronx. Victoria Vance saw the feature article on a Monday morning while drinking coffee at her desk. Her coffee cup froze mid-air. For a long moment, she sat completely motionless, and in that silence, the architecture of white supremacy and entitlement she had assumed secure for 19 years began to emit dangerous structural fractures. Vance reacted swiftly, but it proved to be a fatal miscalculation. Those who act out of panic tend to expose the very mechanisms they seek to conceal. What the professor revealed through 8 days of frantic maneuvering was a sequence of deeply ingrained anxieties and prejudices that, when exposed, bore no resemblance to the cultivated poise she had maintained for 2 decades. First, acting through the Manhattan Academy's communications office, she issued an insidiously worded statement suggesting that the portrait had been substantially enhanced through the technical intervention of a white restoration specialist, hinting that the quality critics were lauding belonged more to Arthur Pendleton's expertise than to the young black student's hand. The statement was craftily framed under the guise of conservation science, but it immediately appeared absurd to anyone familiar with art preservation. When questioned by reporters, Arthur responded with 3 devastating sentences. "I merely mended a torn piece of paper. I did not alter a single line or compositional element of the original work. And in my 40 years of restoration, I have never encountered a technique capable of infusing genius into a canvas if the original work did not already possess it within itself." Undeterred, Vance contacted an intellectual property attorney and dispatched a formal letter to the exhibition organizers, claiming that because the portrait was executed within the institution's walls, the Academy retained conceptual ownership of the work. This desperate maneuver backfired catastrophically, prompting investigative journalists to probe deeper into the history of systemic racism at the Manhattan Academy. Numerous Black and minority alumni began stepping into the light, coming forward with their own accounts of institutional marginalization, psychological isolation, and the microaggressions Vance had maintained as an instrument of racial gatekeeping in her studio for years. The auction of the artwork was organized by the prestigious Christie's Auction House on a Tuesday evening in early November, held in the grand ballroom of a five-star Manhattan hotel. Keefe. Eleanor had proposed the sale, and Maya had agreed, understanding that the ultimate validation of the art market would serve as the most uncompromising response to the injustice she had faced. The ballroom was packed with 300 attendees, alongside dozens of active international phone lines streaming in from London, Paris, and Tokyo. Maya's portrait was the 10th lot of the evening. Chief. As the drawing was brought onto the stage, a sudden, intense concentration gripped the room. The auctioneer opened the bidding at $100,000. Within 90 seconds, the figure skyrocketed past $500,000. Arthur sat in the third row, watching with visible emotion, while Maya sat quietly beside him, preserving the same cautious composure she had held in the studio a year prior. Victoria Vance was also present in the room, clutching a leather portfolio filled with old grade books and studio logs to assert her claim over the assignment's concept. However, when she's attempted to present these documents to a journalist in the lobby before the auction, a writer for The New Yorker bluntly countered. "Are you suggesting, Professor, that because you assigned a topic to a student of color, you own the profound meaning they forged out of their own trauma, blood, and lived experience?" The question silenced her, and the useless documents were forced back into her bag. Inside the ballroom, the bidding quickly erupted into a breathless, head-to-head duel between a private foundation owned by an African-American billionaire and a representative bidding on behalf of the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA. The numbers rapidly escalated past the milestones of $2 million, $3 million, and then $4 million. $4,600,000 for the third and final time. The wooden gavel struck with a sharp, decisive crack. A wave of sound rippled through the room, the sound of an absolute verdict, shattering the invisible glass ceiling that had long weighed down artists of color. Vance stood up and walked rapidly toward the exit before the congratulations could even be read from the podium. Those who observed her departure described her appearance as a hollow shell. A person who had finally come to understand something about the rise of an artistic lineage she had spent a lifetime despising, truth she had deliberately refused to acknowledge until it was too late. She stepped out into the winter cold of Manhattan, alone, as the heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind her. Maya granted only 3 brief, precise interviews. "I wasn't trying to create something monumental to challenge anyone. I was simply trying to tell the truth about the Black mother I love." Vance submitted her resignation to the Manhattan Academy 2 weeks after the auction, preempting a full-scale investigation by the Board of Trustees. The final report documented a pattern of discriminatory pedagogy and racial bias spanning at least a decade, forcing the Academy to issue a public apology, overhaul its scholarship programs, and officially rename the advanced studio the Pendleton Lynn Studio. Arthur accepted the honor with quiet amusement, remaining in his basement refuge to continue mentoring talents pushed to the margins of society. Charlotte went on to build a successful career and proved mature enough to publicly acknowledge her white privilege and the systemic inequities of the educational environment from which she had unwittingly benefited. People can evolve from the failures of a system. The narrative allows for that grace. Maya's mother, Sarah, resigned from her night cleaning job the very next week. On a Saturday morning, Chief, after the auction proceeds were securely transferred into the trust Eleanor had helped establish, Maya returned to their home in the Bronx. She found her mother sitting by the kitchen table, bathed in the early morning sunlight. She had woken up at 10 in the morning. For the first time in 11 long, grueling years, a steaming cup of coffee before her, and upon her face was the serene, liberated expression her daughter had spent a lifetime trying to paint. Maya sat down opposite her mother. She did not reach for her sketchbook. There are moments not meant to be captured by art, but to be lived from within. The following year, Maya established the Elizabeth Lynn Fine Arts Foundation in Brooklyn. The organization provides comprehensive financial aid, materials, and legal protection for young Black, Hispanic, and immigrant artists from working-class families, actively dismantling the authoritarian gatekeeper mechanisms of the elite New York art scene. Within its first 3 years of operation, the foundation sponsored 41 young artists. Several have already mounted solo exhibitions in prominent districts. A 17-year-old African-American girl from Detroit who paints with industrial primer on discarded wood salvaged from construction sites was recently hailed by a major journal as one of the most staggering new voices in contemporary painting. Maya claims no personal credit for discovering them. She claims no credit for anything. She arrives at her studio every day, works, and believes, because her life has left her no choice but to believe that human talent is distributed naturally without regard to socioeconomic origin or race, and that the duty of a just system is simply to stop destroying it. The original charcoal portrait of Sarah now hangs in the primary gallery of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, on a wall that receives the most beautiful light each afternoon. The small placard beside it describes the work briefly and respectfully, omitting any mention of the cruel shears from a year ago. The artwork itself is more than enough. If you stand before the portrait long enough and examine it closely, you can discern the artifact of what transpired. A line, incredibly faint and nearly invisible, runs vertically through the center of the image. It has been mended and sealed to absolute perfection, but it has not been erased. The conservator made a deliberate choice during its restoration to heal the wound but allow it to remain visible. He maintained that the portrait deserved to carry its own history, that a work of art that had survived a tempest of racial injustice should be permitted to show how it endured. The scar left by the force that attempted to destroy it had now become an inseparable component of the artwork's intrinsic value. Authentic talent requires no permission or validation from a dominant culture to exist. Maya Lin's story, at its deepest level, is not about a professor who erred or an institution devoid of empathy. It is about the resilient truth of a world where a genuine masterpiece will always endure. Not because the world has suddenly achieved perfect justice, nor because the gatekeepers have grown selfless, but because the work itself is true, and truth possesses an inherent gravity that, given time and a discerning eye, always finds its rightful place. The drawing had not changed at all. Since the third night Maya completed it on that old dining table in the Bronx, it was whole, complete, and absolute from that very moment. The only thing that changed was the vision of the world around it. And that, ultimately, remains the only question that truly matters. Not whether talent exists, but whether those who hold power possess the courage, the decency, and the willingness to recognize it. In this story, at least one person possessed that courage at the critical moment, a silver-haired man in a dark basement, holding 2 pieces of torn paper, looking deep into them, and deciding that this creation deserved to be whole.